Sarah Martinez had spent 23 years being invisible. Invisible to her family, who saw her only as the quiet daughter who never caused trouble. Invisible to her coworkers who passed her over for promotions despite her perfect attendance and dedication. Invisible to the men who looked right through her average height, unremarkable face, and modest clothing. She had accepted this invisibility as her lot in life, never imagining that sometimes the most overlooked person in the room possesses the most dangerous secrets. But on that humid Tuesday evening in downtown Phoenix, when three men cornered her outside the convenience store and a police sergeant grabbed her wrist with enough force to leave bruises, Sarah's 23 years of invisibility shattered like glass. What happened next would be captured on a dozen cell phone cameras, shared across social media platforms, and force everyone who had ever underestimated her to confront a truth they never saw coming. The woman they had dismissed as weak, forgettable, and defenseless had been hiding something that would change everything they thought they knew about strength, survival, and the power that lies dormant in the most unexpected places. Sarah Martinez wiped down the same counter for the third time that evening, her movements automatic and precise. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Diner cast harsh shadows across her tired face as she glanced at the clock above the register. 9:47. 13 minutes until closing, and then she could finally head home to her small apartment on the edge of town. The diner was nearly empty except for old Mr. Patterson nursing his coffee in booth 3 and a trucker she didn't recognize hunched over a plate of meatloaf at the counter. Sarah had been working at Murphy's for 5 years now, ever since she graduated high school, and the routine had become as familiar as breathing. Clock in at 2, serve the afternoon crowd, handle the dinner rush, clean up, and clock out at 10. Day after day, week after week, year after year. Her manager, Rick Murphy, emerged from the kitchen wiping his greasy hands on his apron. At 52, Rick was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a perpetual scowl that seemed permanently etched into his weathered features. He had inherited the diner from his father and ran it with the same iron fist and penny-pinching mentality that had kept the place barely profitable for decades. "Sarah, when you're done pretending to clean that counter, table 6 needs clearing," Rick barked, not bothering to look at her as he spoke. His tone carried the same dismissive quality it always did, as if her presence was merely tolerated rather than valued. Sarah nodded silently and gathered her cleaning supplies. She had learned long ago that responding to Rick's criticism only made things worse. Better to stay quiet, do her job, and avoid drawing attention to herself. It was a strategy that had served her well throughout her life, though sometimes she wondered if being invisible was really living at all. As she approached table 6, she noticed the newspaper someone had left behind. The headline caught her eye: "Local police department faces scrutiny over use of force allegations." She quickly folded the paper and tucked it into her apron pocket, not because she was particularly interested in the news, but because reading gave her something to do during her break that didn't involve conversation. The truth was, Sarah had never been good with people. She was too quiet, too awkward, too forgettable. In high school, she had been the girl who sat in the back of the classroom, completed her assignments without complaint, and graduated with a B average that was neither impressive nor disappointing. She had no close friends, no romantic relationships, and no particular ambitions beyond getting through each day without incident. Her family treated her with the same benign neglect that seemed to characterize most of her relationships. Her mother, Maria, was a hardworking woman who cleaned houses for wealthy families across town. She loved Sarah in her own distant way, but she was always tired, always stressed, always dealing with her own struggles to make ends meet. Sarah's father had left when she was 12, and her older brother Carlos had joined the army right after high school and rarely came home to visit. The apartment Sarah rented was a studio above Mrs. Chen's grocery store. It was small, poorly insulated, and smelled faintly of the ginger and garlic from the market below, but it was hers. She had furnished it with items from thrift stores and garage sales, creating a space that was functional if not particularly stylish. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of her grandmother, the only person who had ever made Sarah feel truly seen and valued. Her grandmother, Elena Martinez, had died 3 years ago, leaving behind only memories and a small wooden box that Sarah kept hidden under her bed. Elena had been different from the rest of the family. She had immigrated to the United States as a young woman, fleeing circumstances that she never fully explained but that had left her with a steely determination and an air of quiet strength that commanded respect. During Sarah's childhood, Elena had been the one constant source of support and understanding. While everyone else seemed content to let Sarah fade into the background, Elena saw something in her granddaughter that others missed. She would take Sarah on long walks through the neighborhood, teaching her to observe details that others overlooked, to move quietly and purposefully, to trust her instincts even when others questioned them. Mija, Elena would say in her heavily accented English, the world will try to make you small. They will tell you that you're nothing special, that you should be grateful for whatever scraps they throw your way. But you carry something inside you that they cannot see, something they cannot touch. Never let them take that from you. At the time, Sarah hadn't understood what her grandmother meant. She assumed Elena was just trying to make her feel better about being shy and unremarkable. But as she grew older, she began to realize that her grandmother's words carried a weight and significance that went beyond simple encouragement. Elena had taught Sarah other things too, though she had presented them as games rather than lessons. How to move silently across different surfaces, how to read people's body language and intentions, how to defend herself if someone tried to hurt her. Sarah had assumed these were just the paranoid concerns of an old woman who had lived through difficult times, but she had learned the techniques anyway because it made her grandmother happy. After Elena's death, Sarah had felt more alone than ever. The few other family members who came to the funeral treated her with the same polite indifference they always had. Rick had given her exactly 1 day off of the funeral, and when she returned to work, he acted as if nothing had happened. The world continued to turn, customers continued to order their coffee and pie, and Sarah continued to blend into the background like wallpaper. But something had changed in those quiet moments when Sarah was alone in her apartment. She found herself practicing the movements Elena had taught her, not out of any conscious decision, but simply because the physical activity helped quiet her racing thoughts. She would clear away the furniture and run through the sequences her grandmother had shown her, feeling a strange sense of connection to something larger than herself. Sarah had also begun to pay more attention to the people around her, using the observational skills Elena had taught her to read the subtle signs that revealed more than words ever could. She noticed the way Rick's hands shook slightly when he counted the till, suggesting financial stress he never acknowledged. She saw how Mrs. Patterson's wife always ordered for him now, indicating that his memory was failing faster than anyone wanted to admit. She observed the way certain customers looked at her with barely concealed contempt, as if her very existence was an affront to their sense of superiority. These observations might have made other people angry or bitter, but they only reinforced Sarah's commitment to remaining invisible. She had learned that the world could be a cruel place for those who drew attention to themselves, and she had no desire to become a target. Better to stay quiet, stay safe, and avoid giving anyone a reason to notice her. The evening of Everything Changed had started like any other. Sarah arrived at work precisely at 2 o'clock, tied her apron around her waist, and began her shift with a mechanical efficiency that had become second nature. The afternoon crowd was typical for a Tuesday. A few construction workers grabbing coffee and sandwiches, a handful of retirees lingering over pie and gossip, and the usual mix of travelers stopping in from the highway. Around 6 o'clock, 3 men Sarah had never seen before entered the diner. They were all roughly the same age, somewhere in their 30s, with the kind of aggressive swagger that immediately put her on edge. The first man, tall and lean with arms covered in tattoos, slid into a booth near the window. The second, shorter and stockier with a shaved head and gold tooth, sat across from him. The third, who seemed to be their leader, remained standing and surveyed the restaurant with the calculating gaze of someone casing a potential target. Sarah approached their table with her notepad ready, keeping her expression neutral and professional. "Good evening. What can I get you today?" The leader looked her up and down with undisguised disdain before answering. "Coffee. Black. And make it fresh, not that swill you've been serving all day." His companions snickered at this, as if dismissing a waitress was the height of comedy. Sarah simply nodded and returned to the coffee station, where she prepared a fresh pot despite the fact that the existing coffee was less than an hour old. She had learned not to argue with difficult customers, especially ones who seemed to be looking for an excuse to cause trouble. When she returned with their coffee, the men were deep in conversation, speaking in low voices that she couldn't quite make out. She set down their cups and started to walk away, but the leader grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin with unnecessary force. "Hey, waitress," he said, his voice carrying a threatening undertone. "We're going to be here for a while, so you better take good care of us. Understand?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, recognizing the implicit threat in his words but refusing to show fear. "Of course. Let me know if you need anything else." He held her wrist for a moment longer than necessary before releasing it, and Sarah could feel his eyes following her as she walked away. The interaction left her unsettled, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Elena had always told her to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling her that these men meant trouble. The next 2 hours passed slowly, with the three men lingering over their coffee and speaking in hushed tones. They ordered minimal food, just enough to justify taking up the booth, and their eyes seemed to track every customer who entered or left the diner. Sarah began to suspect they weren't there for the food at all, though she couldn't imagine what else they might want from a place like Murphy's. As closing time approached, the diner gradually emptied until only the three men remained. Rick was in the kitchen doing the final cleanup, and Sarah found herself alone in the dining area with customers who were making no move to leave. She approached their table one more time, hoping to encourage their departure without causing a scene. "We'll be closing in about 10 minutes, she said politely. "Can I get you anything else? Or would you like your check?" The leader smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, we were hoping you could help us with something. We're looking for someone, and we think you might know where to find them." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I can help you. I don't really know many people around here." "Oh, but you do know this person," the tattooed man said, pulling out his phone and showing her a photograph. "Elena Martinez. Ring a bell?" Sarah's blood turned to ice as she stared at the image of her grandmother, taken sometime in the last few years of Elena's life. The photograph showed Elena walking down a street Sarah didn't recognize, but her grandmother's face was unmistakable. Questions flooded Sarah's mind. How did these men know about Elena? Why were they looking for her? And, most importantly, what did they want with a woman who had been dead for 3 years? "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, though her voice betrayed her shock. The stocky man laughed. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't insult our intelligence. Elena Martinez was your grandmother, wasn't she? We know she lived here for the last 20 years of her life. We know she was close to you. And we know she left something behind when she died." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this information. Elena had indeed left something behind, the wooden box that Sarah kept hidden under her bed, but she had never opened it or investigated its contents. She had assumed it contained personal mementos, photographs, maybe some jewelry. The idea that it might contain something valuable enough to attract the attention of dangerous men had never occurred to her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she repeated, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they wouldn't believe her. The leader stood up slowly, his full height intimidating in the confined space of the booth. "Listen carefully, little girl. Your grandmother took something that didn't belong to her, and now we're here to collect it. You can make this easy on yourself and tell us where she hid it, or we can make things difficult. Your choice." Before Sarah could respond, Rick emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He took in the scene with confusion, noting the tension in the air, but not understanding its source. "Everything okay out here?" Rick asked, though his tone suggested he was more annoyed by the delay in closing than concerned about Sarah's well-being. "Just finishing up," the leader said smoothly, his demeanor shifting to one of casual friendliness. "Great coffee, by the way. We'll definitely be back." The three men left money on the table and walked out of the diner, but not before the leader leaned close to Sarah and whispered, "We'll be seeing you soon. Think about what we discussed." After they were gone, Sarah stood frozen in place, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Elena had never mentioned being involved with dangerous people or possessing anything of significant value. She had lived modestly, worked as a seamstress, and seemed to have few possessions beyond the basic necessities of life. The idea that she had been hiding some kind of secret was almost impossible to believe. Rick looked at Sarah with irritation. "Well, don't just stand there. Clear the table and let's get out of here." Sarah mechanically gathered the coffee cups and wiped down the table, her movements automatic while her thoughts churned. As she counted out the register and completed her closing duties, she found herself looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see the three men watching her from the parking lot. When she finally left the diner that night, Sarah walked quickly to her car, checking her surroundings with the careful attention Elena had taught her. The parking lot was empty except for Rick's truck and her own aging Honda Civic, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The drive home took 15 minutes, and Sarah spent every moment of it thinking about her grandmother and the mysterious box hidden under her bed. For 3 years, she had honored Elena's final wishes by keeping the box safe and unopened, but now it seemed that its contents might hold the key to understanding why dangerous men were suddenly interested in her quiet, unremarkable life. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with her keys. Once inside, she locked the door behind her and drew the curtains closed before kneeling beside her bed and retrieving the wooden box from its hiding place. The box was about the size of a shoebox, made of dark wood with intricate carvings around the edges. Elena had given it to her 2 weeks before she died, with strict instructions to keep it safe and never let anyone else know of its existence. At the time, Sarah had assumed it was just her grandmother's way of ensuring that some family mementos wouldn't be lost or thrown away after her death. Now, as she held the box in her hands, Sarah realized that her grandmother's final gift might be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to open it and discover what Elena had hidden away, or whether to maintain her ignorance and hope that the three men would lose interest and move on to other targets. But deep down, Sarah already knew that her days of invisibility were over. Whatever was in that box had already drawn dangerous attention to her quiet life, and there would be no going back to the safety of being overlooked and ignored. For the first time in her 23 years, Sarah Martinez was about to discover what it meant to be truly seen, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the consequences. Sarah spent the entire night staring at the wooden box, turning it over in her hands and tracing the intricate patterns carved into its surface. The carvings were more detailed than she had noticed before, featuring symbols and designs that seemed vaguely familiar but that she couldn't quite place. In the harsh light of her apartment's overhead bulb, the box looked ancient and somehow ominous, as if it contained secrets that were meant to stay buried. By morning, exhaustion had won out over curiosity, and Sarah had fallen asleep on her small couch with the box clutched against her chest. She woke to the sound of her alarm at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, her neck stiff from sleeping in an awkward position, and her mind immediately focused on the events of the previous evening. The three men's faces were burned into her memory, along with the casual way they had threatened her, and the certainty in their voices when they spoke about Elena taking something that belonged to them. Sarah tried to reconcile this image with her memories of her grandmother, the quiet woman who had spent her evenings sewing and watching telenovelas, who had never seemed to have much money or many possessions. After a quick shower and a cup of coffee, Sarah called in sick to work. It was the first time in 5 years that she had taken an unscheduled day off, and Rick's irritated response made it clear that he considered her illness to be an inconvenience rather than a legitimate concern. But Sarah couldn't imagine facing another day at the diner while her mind was consumed with questions about Elena and the box. She spent the morning researching Elena Martinez online, something she had never thought to do before. The search results were disappointingly sparse. Elena appeared in a few census records and immigration documents, confirming that she had arrived in the United States in 1987 as a 28-year-old woman from Mexico. There were no social media profiles, no news articles, no photographs beyond what appeared in official government databases. The lack of information was almost more unsettling than finding something suspicious would have been. Elena had lived in the same community for nearly 40 years, had worked and paid taxes and raised a family, yet she had managed to maintain an almost complete absence from the digital record. For someone who had supposedly lived a quiet, unremarkable life, Elena had been remarkably successful at avoiding documentation. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself pacing her small apartment, unable to concentrate on anything other than the box. She had promised Elena never to open it, but she had made that promise when she assumed it contained harmless family mementos. Now, with dangerous men asking questions and making threats, the situation had changed dramatically. Finally, as the sun began to set, Sarah made her decision. She retrieved the box from where she had left it on the coffee table and examined it more carefully, looking for some way to open it without damaging the wood. After several minutes of careful exploration, she discovered that one of the carved symbols could be pressed inward like a button. When she applied gentle pressure, there was a soft clicking sound, and the lid of the box popped open slightly. Inside, Sarah found a collection of items that immediately shattered her understanding of who Elena Martinez had been. The first thing that caught her eye was a passport, but not the Mexican passport she would have expected. This passport was Colombian, issued in 1985 to someone named Isabella Herrera. The photograph showed a younger version of Elena, perhaps in her mid-20s, but the name and nationality were completely different from what Sarah had always believed. Beneath the passport were several other documents, all bearing the name Isabella Herrera. There was a birth certificate from Bogota, a driver's license, and what appeared to be official government identification cards from Colombia. There was also a small black notebook filled with handwritten notes in Spanish, though Sarah's limited knowledge of the language made it difficult to decipher more than a few words. At the bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in a piece of soft cloth, Sarah found something that made her hand shake: a small USB drive and a letter addressed to her in Elena's distinctive handwriting. The letter was written in English, though Elena's accent came through clearly in the word choices and sentence structure. "My dear Sarah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and the people from my past have finally found us. I had hoped this day would never come, but I have always known it was a possibility. The woman you knew as Elena Martinez never existed. My real name is Isabella Herrera, and I came to this country not as an immigrant seeking a better life, but as a refugee fleeing for my safety. The life I built here, the family I raised, the quiet existence I maintained for so many years, all of it was constructed to hide the truth about who I really was and what I had done. In Colombia, I worked for people who dealt in information. Not the kind of information that appears in newspapers or government reports, but the kind that powerful people will kill to protect. I was very good at my job, perhaps too good, because eventually I learned something that I was never meant to know. The USB drive in this box contains documents and recordings that could destroy the careers and lives of several very wealthy and influential people, both in Colombia and here in the United States. These people have been searching for this information for over 25 years, and they will not stop until they recover it or eliminate everyone who might possess it. I kept this information not because I wanted to use it for personal gain, but because it was the only thing that kept me alive. As long as they believed I might release it if they harmed me, they would leave me alone. It was a dangerous game, but it allowed me to live long enough to watch you grow up and to try to prepare you for what might come. Sarah, You are not the weak, invisible girl that everyone believes you to be. The exercises I taught you, the skills I showed you, the way I trained you to observe and move and think, none of it was random. I was preparing you for the possibility that someday you would need to protect yourself and this information. The USB drive contains enough evidence to send dozens of people to prison for the rest of their lives. Drug trafficking, money laundering, murder, corruption at the highest levels of government and business. But it also contains enough secrets to get you killed if the wrong people discover you have it. You have three choices, Mija. You could destroy the USB drive and hope they believe you when you tell them you know nothing. You can try to use the information to bargain for your safety, though this is extremely dangerous and unlikely to succeed. Or you can do what I could never bring myself to do. Take the evidence to the authorities and trust that justice will prevail. I cannot tell you which choice to make, because each one carries terrible risks. But I can tell you this. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more capable than anyone has ever given you credit for. Whatever you decide, trust your instincts and remember everything I taught you. I am sorry that my past has reached out to threaten your future. You deserve to live a peaceful life, free from the shadows that have haunted me for so long. But perhaps this is also an opportunity for you to discover who you really are beneath the mask of invisibility you have worn for so many years. Be careful, Mija. Trust no one completely, but do not let fear paralyze you. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one that no one sees coming. With all my love and all my hope for your future, Isabella, Elena. Sarah read the letter 3 times before the full weight of its implications sank in. Her quiet, unassuming grandmother had been living under a false identity, carrying state secrets, and preparing for the day when her dangerous past would catch up with her. The skills Elena had taught her, presented as games and exercises, had actually been training for survival in a world where information was currency and knowledge could be lethal. The USB drive felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's hand as she considered her options. Destroying it would be the safest choice for her personally, but it would also mean that whatever crimes were documented on the drive would go unpunished. Using it to bargain for her safety assumed that the people hunting for it could be trusted to honor such an agreement, which seemed unlikely given that they had already threatened her with violence. Taking the evidence to the authorities was appealing in principle, but Sarah had no idea who could be trusted with information this sensitive. Elena's letter suggested that the corruption reached into high levels of government, which meant that approaching the wrong official could result in the evidence being suppressed and Sarah being silenced permanently. As she weighed these impossible choices, Sarah became aware of a sound that made her blood freeze. Footsteps on the stairs outside her apartment. They were careful, deliberate footsteps, the kind made by someone trying to move quietly, but still be heard by someone listening carefully. Sarah quickly closed the box and shoved it under her couch cushions, her heart racing as the footsteps stopped directly outside her door. There was a soft knocking, almost polite, followed by a voice she recognized from the diner. "Sarah, we know you're in there. We just want to talk." It was the leader of the 3 men, his tone friendly and reasonable, as if they were old friends stopping by for a casual visit. Sarah knew better than to trust the deceptive calm in his voice, but she also realized that hiding would only delay the inevitable confrontation. She approached the door slowly, keeping her movements as quiet as possible. Through the peephole, she could see all 3 men standing in the hallway, positioned in a way that would allow them to rush the door if she tried to run. "What do you want?" Sarah called through the door, proud that her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Just to talk, like I said, about your grandmother and the things she left behind." "Open the door, Sarah. This doesn't have to be difficult." Sarah's mind raced through her options. The apartment had only one exit, and the men were blocking it. The windows faced the alley behind the building, with a drop that would likely result in broken bones, even if she managed to climb down safely. Elena had taught her to fight, but she had never tested those skills against multiple opponents in a real confrontation. I don't have anything that belonged to my grandmother, Sarah said, stalling for time while she tried to think of a strategy. She didn't leave me anything valuable. The man's laugh was cold and humorless. Come on, Sarah. We've been watching you for weeks. We know she gave you something before she died. We know you've been keeping it safe, just like she taught you to do. But the thing is, it was never really hers to give away. The admission that they had been watching her for weeks sent a chill down Sarah's spine. How had she failed to notice surveillance that had been going on for so long? Elena had taught her to be observant, to watch for signs that she was being followed or watched, but apparently her training had been insufficient to detect professional surveillance. We're going to count to 10, the stocky man called out, his voice much less friendly than his leader's. If you don't open this door, we're going to open it ourselves. And then this conversation is going to become a lot more unpleasant for everyone involved. Sarah looked around her apartment desperately, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon or provide an escape route. Her eyes fell on the kitchen knives, but she dismissed them immediately. Elena had taught her that edged weapons were dangerous in close quarters unless you were absolutely certain you could maintain control of them. Instead, she grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove and positioned herself beside the door, pressed against the wall where she would be hidden when it opened. Elena had taught her that the element of surprise was often more valuable than superior strength or numbers. 10, the leader called out, and Sarah heard the sound of metal against metal as someone worked on her lock. 9, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember everything Elena had taught her about fighting. Stay calm, move with purpose, use your opponent's momentum against them, strike hard and fast, and then get away. 8, the lock clicked, and Sarah heard the door handle turn. 7, the door swung open slowly, and the first man stepped into the apartment cautiously, clearly expecting resistance. Sarah waited until he was fully inside before moving, stepping out from behind the door and swinging the skillet in a wide arc toward his head. The blow connected with a solid thunk, and the man dropped to the floor like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. The second man rushed through the door, but Sarah was already moving, using the momentum from her first swing to spin around and catch him across the ribs with the edge of the skillet. He doubled over in pain, gasping for breath, and Sarah brought her knee up hard into his face. There was a sickening crunch, and blood began pouring from his broken nose. The leader was through the door now, and Sarah could see that he was bigger and more dangerous than his companions. He moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in combat, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a professional killer. Impressive, he said, circling her slowly while his two companions groaned on the floor. Elena taught you well, but parlor tricks won't be enough to save you now. Sarah kept the skillet raised and ready, backing toward the kitchen to maintain distance and keep her options open. What do you want with my grandmother's things? Your grandmother stole from us, the man said, continuing his slow advance. She took something very valuable, something that could cause a lot of trouble for a lot of important people. We've been very patient, waiting for the right moment to recover it. But patience has its limits. She never stole anything, Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words, she realized they weren't true. Elena had stolen something, or at least taken something she wasn't supposed to have. The question was whether she had been justified in doing so. The man smiled, and Sarah saw that he was enjoying this confrontation. Your loyalty is admirable, but misplaced. Elena Herrera was a thief and a blackmailer who caused a lot of people a lot of pain. The world is better off without her. The casual way he spoke about Elena's death made Sarah realize something that chilled her to the bone. You killed her. Cancer killed her, the man said with mock sympathy. We just help speed up the process a little. Amazing how quickly someone can deteriorate when their medication is adjusted. Rage flooded through Sarah like fire, burning away years of timidity and fear. Elena hadn't died naturally. These men had murdered her, probably because they thought she would reveal their secrets on her deathbed. They had taken away the one person in the world who had truly understood and cared for Sarah, and Now they wanted to take away everything Elena had left behind. "Where is it, Sarah?" the man asked, his voice becoming harder. "Where is the information Elena stole from us?" Sarah's grip on the skillet tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man sighed theatrically and pulled out a gun, holding it casually, but pointed in her general direction. "I really hoped we could do this the easy way. But I suppose your grandmother's stubbornness runs in the family." Sarah's training kicked in automatically, Elena's voice echoing in her memory. When someone draws a weapon, they have committed to using it. Your only choice is to act before they can complete their intent. Move fast, move decisively, and never hesitate. The apartment was small enough that the distance between Sarah and her attacker could be closed in 2 quick steps. As the man raised his gun to take more deliberate aim, Sarah hurled the skillet directly at his face with all her strength. The man ducked instinctively, and in that moment of distraction, Sarah launched herself forward. Elena had taught her that guns were most dangerous at a distance, but in close quarters, they became a liability. If you could get inside your opponent's reach, their weapon could be turned against them. Sarah crashed into the man with all her weight, driving her shoulder into his midsection and wrapping her arms around his waist to prevent him from bringing the gun to bear. They fell to the floor together, wrestling for control of the weapon. The man was stronger than Sarah, but she had advantages he didn't expect. She was smaller and more agile, able to shift her weight and change position faster than he could compensate. More importantly, she was fighting for her life while he was just doing a job. Elena had taught her to target specific points on the human body that would cause maximum damage with minimum effort. Sarah drove her elbow into the man's solar plexus, forcing the air from his lungs. While he gasped for breath, she grabbed his wrist and twisted it sharply, using a joint lock Elena had shown her to force him to release the gun. The weapon skittered across the floor, out of reach of both combatants. The man tried to throw Sarah off him, but she maintained her position, continuing to attack the pressure points and nerve clusters Elena had shown her. "You little bitch," the man snarled, his professional demeanor finally cracking. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Sarah's response was to drive her knee into his kidney with enough force to make him cry out in pain. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she said, surprised by the cold fury in her own voice. "You're the men who killed my grandmother." The fight continued for several more minutes, neither combatant able to gain a decisive advantage. The man's superior strength was offset by Sarah's speed and the element of surprise. But Sarah knew she couldn't maintain this intensity indefinitely. She was already beginning to tire, and once exhaustion set in, his physical advantages would become overwhelming. That's when she heard the sirens. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the chaos of the fight like a blade, causing both Sarah and her attacker to freeze momentarily. The wailing grew louder, suggesting multiple police vehicles converging on the building, and Sarah felt a surge of hope. Someone must have heard the commotion and called for help. The man beneath her cursed viciously and redoubled his efforts to escape her grip. "This isn't over," he snarled, managing to throw her off him and scramble toward the door. His 2 companions, one still unconscious and the other barely conscious with his broken nose, were in no condition to flee quickly. Sarah watched from the floor as the leader grabbed the man with a broken nose and hauled him to his feet. "Move," he commanded, supporting his injured companion as they stumbled toward the stairs. The unconscious man was abandoned where he lay, apparently deemed expendable in the face of approaching law enforcement. Within minutes, Sarah could hear heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs, followed by authoritative voices calling for everyone to stay calm and show their hands. She remained on the floor of her apartment, her heart still racing from the confrontation, as uniformed police officers appeared in her doorway. "Ma'am, are you injured?" asked the first officer to enter, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. She kept her hand near her weapon, but didn't draw it, taking in the scene with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to domestic disturbances. "I'm okay," Sarah managed to say, though her voice was shaky. "They broke into my apartment. I was defending myself. The unconscious man on her floor was beginning to stir, groaning softly as he regained consciousness. Within moments, 2 more officers had entered the apartment, and the injured man was being helped to his feet and placed in handcuffs. "Can you tell us what happened here?" asked a sergeant who had just arrived on the scene. Sarah recognized him immediately as Sergeant Robert Mitchell, a man whose reputation in the community was complicated. Some people praised his dedication to keeping the streets safe, while others whispered about his aggressive tactics and questionable judgment. Mitchell was a large man in his early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen too much of humanity's darker side. He carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, and there was something in his eyes that made Sarah immediately uncomfortable. As Sarah began to explain the evening's events, she found herself editing her story carefully. She told the officers about the 3 men who had approached her at the diner, about their threats and questions regarding her grandmother, and about how they had broken into her apartment. But she said nothing about Elena's real identity, the USB drive, or the contents of the wooden box. "So these men claimed your grandmother had something that belonged to them?" Mitchell asked, his tone suggesting skepticism. "What kind of something?" "I don't know," Sarah said truthfully. "They wouldn't tell me. They just kept saying she had taken something that wasn't hers." Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah's face. "And you have no idea what they might have been referring to? Nothing your grandmother left you that might be valuable?" Sarah shook her head, maintaining eye contact despite her growing unease. She didn't have much. Some old photographs, a few pieces of jewelry. Nothing that would be worth breaking into someone's apartment for. The injured man in handcuffs had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. Despite his broken nose and obvious pain, he seemed desperate to communicate something to the officers. "She's lying," he said, his voice distorted by the damage to his nose. "The old lady stole something from us years ago. This girl knows where it is." Mitchell turned his attention to the injured man with interest. "What exactly did she steal?" "Information," the man said, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean money. She owed us money." Sarah could see that Mitchell wasn't buying this explanation any more than she was. The man's story didn't make sense, and his obvious desperation suggested that much more was at stake than a simple debt. "We're going to need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement," Mitchell told Sarah. "This is clearly a serious matter, and we need to get all the facts straight." Sarah nodded, though she felt increasingly trapped by the situation. Going to the police station would provide safety in the short term, but it would also put her in a position where she would be pressed for more details about Elena and the events of the evening. Sooner or later, she would have to decide whether to reveal the truth about the USB drive and its contents. As the officers prepared to leave with their prisoner, Mitchell approached Sarah with a business card. "My direct number," he said. "Call me if you remember anything else about what these men might have been looking for. Sometimes details come back to you after the shock wears off." Sarah took the card, noting the way Mitchell held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. There was something about his interest in the case that felt personal rather than professional, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what was troubling her about his manner. After the police left, Sarah was alone in her apartment with the aftermath of the evening's violence. Her furniture was overturned, there were bloodstains on the carpet, and the front door hung askew on damaged hinges. But more troubling than the physical damage was the realization that her safety had been fundamentally compromised. The men who had attacked her knew where she lived and worked. They had been watching her for weeks without her knowledge, and the leader had escaped to continue his pursuit of Elena's secrets. Staying in her apartment was no longer an option, but Sarah had limited resources and nowhere obvious to go. She retrieved the wooden box from under the couch cushions and studied Elena's letter again, looking for clues about what she should do next. The letter mentioned that the corruption documented on the USB drive reached into high levels of government, which suggested that even the police might not be trustworthy. Mitchell's intense interest in the case suddenly seemed more ominous in this context. Sarah spent the next hour packing a small bag with essential items, including the wooden box and its contents. She couldn't stay in the apartment, but she also couldn't simply disappear without a plan. Elena had spent 25 years successfully hiding from dangerous people, and she had left behind instructions and resources that might help Sarah do the same. The notebook Sarah had found in the box was filled with what appeared to be contact information, addresses, and coded references that might represent safe houses or trusted allies. Most of the entries were in Spanish, but there were a few English notations that might provide starting points for someone trying to disappear. As Sarah prepared to leave her apartment, possibly forever, she found herself thinking about the person she had become during the fight with the intruders. For those few minutes, she had been someone else entirely, someone strong and dangerous and unafraid. Elena's training had emerged from some deep part of her consciousness, guiding her actions with an instinctive knowledge that she hadn't known she possessed. The timid waitress who had spent 5 years invisible behind the counter at Murphy's Diner was gone, replaced by someone who could break a man's nose and fight for her life without hesitation. Sarah wasn't sure whether this transformation was temporary or permanent, but she knew that there was no going back to the person she had been before. The next morning, Sarah called into work and quit her job, citing a family emergency that required her to leave town immediately. Rick's response was predictably unsympathetic, and he made it clear that she shouldn't expect her job to be waiting if she changed her mind. Sarah's next stop was the bank, where she withdrew her modest savings and closed her account. It wasn't much money, but it would have to be enough to survive while she figured out her next move. She also retrieved the contents of her safety deposit box, which contained her birth certificate, social security card, and other important documents that would be necessary if she needed to establish a new identity. Her final stop before leaving town was the cemetery where Elena was buried. Sarah had visited the grave only once since the funeral, finding it too painful to confront the finality of her grandmother's death. Now, standing before the simple headstone that read, Elena Martinez, beloved grandmother, Sarah felt a complex mixture of grief, anger, and determination. "I know who you really were," she whispered to the stone. "I know what you did and why you did it. And I'm going to make sure that the people who hurt you don't get away with it." As Sarah turned to leave the cemetery, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the entrance. Sergeant Mitchell was leaning against his patrol car, watching her with an expression of professional interest that didn't quite mask something else beneath the surface. "Thought I might find you here," he said as Sarah approached. "Paying respects to your grandmother?" "Something like that," Sarah replied carefully. "Is there something you needed, Sergeant?" Mitchell pushed himself away from the car and moved closer, his body language shifting in a way that made Sarah's instincts scream danger. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, about the men who broke into your apartment and what they might have been looking for." Sarah kept her expression neutral while her mind raced through possible responses. "I told you everything I know." "See, that's the thing," Mitchell said, his tone becoming more conversational, but somehow more threatening. "I don't think you did. I think your grandmother left you something very specific, something that certain people would pay handsomely to recover." The casual way he mentioned payment confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions about his motives. Mitchell wasn't investigating the break-in as a police officer seeking justice. He was investigating it as someone with a personal interest in what Elena had hidden. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, taking a step back toward her car. Mitchell's hand moved to rest on his service weapon, not drawing it, but making its presence known. "I think you do know, Sarah, and I think you're going to tell me, because the alternative is much worse than you can imagine." This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Sarah could submit to Mitchell's intimidation and hope that cooperation would save her life. She could try to run and hope that she was faster than a bullet. Or she could do what Elena had trained her to do, fight back against overwhelming odds and trust her instincts to guide her through. Sarah's choice was made in an instant, driven by the same cold fury that had sustained her through the fight in her apartment. These people had killed Elena, threatened her, and now corrupted the very police officers who were supposed to protect her. Enough was enough. "You're right, Sergeant," she said, her voice steady and calm. My grandmother did leave me something. Something you and your friends have been looking for. Mitchell's eyes lit up with greedy anticipation. Good girl. I knew you'd see reason eventually. Where is it? Sarah smiled, and there was nothing timid or frightened in the expression. It's somewhere safe. Somewhere you'll never find it. Because unlike my grandmother, I don't plan to spend the rest of my life running from people like you. Mitchell's face darkened with anger and frustration. You have no idea who you're dealing with, little girl. The people I work with have resources you can't imagine. They can make you disappear without a trace, and no one will ever ask questions about what happened to a nobody waitress. Maybe, Sarah said, continuing to back toward her car. But first you have to catch me. Mitchell reached for his weapon, but Sarah was already moving. Elena had taught her that the key to escaping from a dangerous situation was to create chaos and confusion, to make yourself a difficult target while giving yourself opportunities to strike back. Sarah grabbed a handful of gravel from the cemetery's driveway and threw it directly at Mitchell's face, causing him to flinch and momentarily lose sight of her. In that instant, she reached her car and threw herself behind the wheel, grateful that she had left the engine running. Mitchell was shouting and fumbling for his radio as Sarah's car screeched out of the cemetery parking lot. She could see him in her rearview mirror, gesturing angrily as he spoke into his radio, probably calling for backup and putting out an alert for her vehicle. Sarah knew that she had perhaps minutes before every police officer in the city was looking for her car. She needed to disappear quickly and completely, and she needed to do it in a way that would buy her time to figure out how to use Elena's information to destroy the people who had destroyed so many lives. The scared, invisible waitress was truly gone now, replaced by someone who understood that survival required more than just hiding. Sarah Martinez was about to discover just how dangerous a person could become when they had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The city limits were only 10 miles away, and beyond them lay a vast country where a determined person could disappear if they were smart enough and careful enough. Elena had managed it once, and she had left her granddaughter the tools to do it again. But this time, the person running wouldn't be content to simply hide and hope for the best. This time, the hunter was about to become the hunted, and the people who had spent decades believing themselves untouchable were about to learn that their past had finally caught up with them. As Sarah's car disappeared into the flow of highway traffic, Sergeant Mitchell was left standing in the cemetery, surrounded by the graves of people who had taken their secrets to their deaths. But Elena Martinez had been different. She had found a way to reach beyond the grave and arm her granddaughter with the weapons needed to finish a fight that had been going on for far too long. The final confrontation was coming, and this time, the outcome would be very different from what anyone expected. 3 months after fleeing her hometown, Sarah Martinez had become someone entirely different. The timid waitress who had once apologized for taking up space had been replaced by a careful, calculating woman who moved through the world like a shadow, leaving no digital footprints and trusting no one completely. She had followed Elena's notebook to a small town in Montana, where a coded entry had led her to an elderly man named Thomas Valdez, who ran a used bookstore on the edge of town. When Sarah had approached him with the specific phrase Elena had written in her notes, Thomas had studied her with sharp eyes before nodding slowly and leading her to a back room filled with equipment that had nothing to do with selling books. Thomas, it turned out, had been part of Elena's network, one of several people who had helped her establish her new identity years earlier. He was a former CIA operative who had become disillusioned with the agency's methods and had spent his retirement helping people disappear when their lives were threatened by powerful enemies. Under Thomas's guidance, Sarah had learned skills that Elena had never taught her: how to create false identification documents, how to access encrypted communication networks, how to move money without creating a trail that could be followed. Most importantly, she had learned how to use Elena's USB drive to access the information it contained without triggering the security measures that would alert the people hunting for it. The contents of the drive were even more damaging than Elena's letter had suggested. There were detailed financial records showing how Colombian drug cartels had laundered hundreds of millions of dollars through American banks and real estate companies. There were recordings of phone conversations in which senior government officials discussed covering up murders and framing innocent people. There were photographs and documents that prove corruption reaching into the highest levels of law enforcement, including evidence that several federal judges have been bought and paid for by criminal organizations. Most relevant to Sarah's immediate situation were the files documenting the activities of a group calling itself the Phoenix Syndicate, a collection of corrupt officials, business leaders, and criminal figures who had been operating for over 30 years. The syndicate's members included Sergeant Mitchell, the three men who had broken into her apartment, and at least a dozen other people in positions of authority who had been using their power to protect criminal enterprises while eliminating anyone who threatened their operations. Elena had been working as a courier and document specialist for one of the Phoenix Syndicate's Colombian partners when she discovered the true scope of their activities. Her job had required her to translate and organize communications between the American and Colombian branches of the operation, giving her access to information that revealed the full extent of their crimes. When Elena realized that children were being trafficked as part of the syndicate's operations, she had made the decision that would change her life forever. She had copied everything she could access and disappeared with evidence that could destroy dozens of lives and careers. For 25 years, she had used that information as insurance, letting the syndicate know that any attempt to harm her would result in the evidence being released to law enforcement agencies and media outlets around the world. Sarah spent weeks studying the files, cross-referencing names and dates, building a comprehensive picture of how the syndicate operated and who its current members were. She discovered that Mitchell had been promoted to lieutenant since her escape, probably as a reward for his continued loyalty to the organization. The man who had led the break-in at her apartment was identified as Marcus Webb, a former military contractor who specialized in eliminating problems for wealthy clients. But the most shocking discovery was a recent document showing that the syndicate was planning to eliminate all remaining witnesses to their earlier crimes, regardless of the potential consequences. Elena's death had been part of a broader campaign to tie up loose ends before several syndicate members retired or moved on to other positions. Sarah's name was on a list of targets to be eliminated within the next 6 months. This knowledge transformed Sarah's situation from one of defensive hiding to active warfare. She could continue running and hope to stay ahead of professional killers indefinitely, or she could take the offensive and use Elena's information to destroy the people hunting her before they could complete their plan. Thomas had warned her against attempting to take on the syndicate directly. "These people have been playing this game for decades," he said during one of their planning sessions. "They have resources, connections, and experience that you can't match. The smart play is to disappear completely and let someone else deal with the justice part." But Sarah had learned something about herself during her months of hiding and preparation. She wasn't content to simply survive while knowing that other people would suffer and die because she had chosen the safe path. Elena had carried the burden of this knowledge for 25 years, living every day with the awareness that her silence was allowing terrible crimes to continue. "If I don't stop them, who will?" Sarah had asked Thomas. "They've corrupted law enforcement, bought judges, and eliminated witnesses for 3 decades. How many more people have to die while we wait for someone else to do what's necessary?" Thomas had studied her with the same sharp eyes he had used during their first meeting. "You're not the same frightened girl who came to me 3 months ago, but you're talking about going to war with people who have more experience killing than you have breathing." "Then I'll have to be smarter than they are," Sarah had replied. "And I'll have to make sure they don't see me coming until it's too late." The plan Sarah developed was ambitious and dangerous, but it was also the only approach that offered a realistic chance of success. Rather than trying to present Elena's evidence to authorities who might be corrupted or intimidated, she would use it to turn the syndicate members against each other, while simultaneously exposing their crimes to the public in a way that could not be suppressed or controlled. The key was to make each member of the syndicate believe that the others were planning to betray them. Sarah would use the information Elena had gathered to create evidence of fictional betrayals, planting seeds of suspicion and paranoia that would cause the organization to tear itself apart from within. Her first target was Marcus Webb, the man who had broken into her apartment and who was still actively hunting for her. Sarah had discovered that Webb was skimming money from syndicate operations, using his position to enrich himself at the expense of his partners. All she had to do was make sure the other syndicate members learned about his theft in a way that would make them believe he was planning to disappear with their money. Sarah created a series of fake communications that appeared to show Webb negotiating the sale of syndicate secrets to a rival organization. She planted these communications where other syndicate members would find them, then waited for the inevitable reaction. Within a week, Webb had been found dead in his apartment, killed with the same professional efficiency that he had once used against the syndicate's enemies. The official police report listed the death as a robbery gone wrong, but Sarah knew better. The Phoenix Syndicate had eliminated one of its own members based on evidence that she had fabricated. The success of this operation gave Sarah the confidence to move against larger targets. Her next objective was Lieutenant Mitchell, the corrupt police officer who had threatened her at Elena's grave. Sarah had discovered that Mitchell was using his position to provide protection for syndicate drug operations, taking payments in exchange for advance warning about law enforcement activities. Rather than simply exposing Mitchell's corruption, Sarah decided to make it appear that he was working as an informant for federal authorities. She created fake FBI documents suggesting that Mitchell had been providing information about syndicate operations in exchange for immunity from prosecution. These documents were carefully crafted to appear authentic, complete with official letterhead and realistic case numbers. Sarah arranged for these fake documents to be discovered by syndicate members in a way that would make them believe Mitchell was preparing to testify against them. She planted evidence in Mitchell's personal vehicle and arranged for it to be found during a routine traffic stop conducted by officers she knew were loyal to the syndicate. The reaction was swift and decisive. Mitchell was found shot to death in his patrol car 3 days later, killed while responding to what appeared to be a routine domestic disturbance call. The official investigation would conclude that he had been killed by an armed suspect who had then fled the scene. But Sarah knew that the Phoenix Syndicate had once again eliminated one of its own based on her carefully planted evidence. As word of Webb's and Mitchell's death spread through the criminal underworld, Sarah could see the paranoia and suspicion beginning to take hold within the syndicate. Members who had trusted each other for years were now looking over their shoulders, wondering which of their colleagues might be planning to betray them next. But Sarah's most ambitious operation was still ahead of her. She had identified Judge Harold Morrison as one of the syndicate's most valuable assets, a federal judge who had been dismissing cases and reducing sentences for syndicate members for over a decade. Morrison was also the most dangerous target, protected by federal security and surrounded by people who would investigate any threat against him. Sarah's plan for Morrison was more complex than her previous operations. Rather than trying to turn the syndicate against him, she would expose his corruption in a way that would force a public investigation while simultaneously making it impossible for the syndicate to protect him. Using Elena's files, Sarah compiled a comprehensive dossier of Morrison's criminal activities, complete with bank records, recorded phone conversations, and photographic evidence of his meetings with known criminals. But rather than simply releasing this information to the media, she would ensure that it reached multiple law enforcement agencies simultaneously, making it impossible for the syndicate to suppress the investigation. Sarah had spent weeks studying Morrison's habits and routines, looking for an opportunity to plant evidence where it would be discovered by people outside the syndicate's influence. She finally found her opening when she learned that Morrison was scheduled to speak at a legal conference in Washington, D.C., an event that would be attended by hundreds of federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and Justice Department officials. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution. Sarah would have to infiltrate the conference, plant the evidence where it would be discovered by the right people, and escape before anyone realized what had happened. It was the kind of operation that professional intelligence operatives spent months planning, and Sarah would have to do it alone with minimal resources and no backup. The night before the conference, Sarah broke into Morrison's hotel room and planted copies of Elena's files in his luggage, hidden in a way that would make them appear to be Morrison's own records. She also installed a small recording device in his briefcase, programmed to begin broadcasting incriminating conversations to a list of federal law enforcement frequencies. The next morning, as Morrison prepared to deliver his keynote address about judicial integrity, Sarah activated the recording device from her position in the conference audience. The device began broadcasting selected recordings from Elena's files, including conversations in which Morrison discussed accepting bribes and fixing cases for criminal defendants. The effect was immediate and devastating. Federal agents in the audience heard Morrison's own voice describing his criminal activities in explicit detail. Within minutes, the conference hall was surrounded by law enforcement officers, and Morrison was taken into custody on charges that would eventually result in a life sentence. But Sarah's victory came with a price. As she tried to leave the conference venue, she found herself face to face with two men she recognized from Elena's files as high-ranking syndicate members. They had been watching the conference, probably as security for Morrison, and they had identified Sarah as the source of their recent problems. Isabella Herrera, one of them said, using Elena's real name with deliberate emphasis. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." Sarah realized that her months of careful planning and preparation had led to this moment, a direct confrontation with the people who had spent decades believing themselves untouchable. The scared waitress who had once hidden behind invisibility was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that some fights could only be won by those willing to risk everything. The final battle was about to begin, and this time there would be no running away. Sarah looked at the two men blocking her path and felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. After months of careful planning and strategic strikes against the Phoenix Syndicate, the moment she had been preparing for had finally arrived. These weren't hired thugs like the men who had broken into her apartment. These were the Syndicate's leaders, the people who had given the orders that resulted in Elena's death and countless other murders over the years. The older of the two men was Vincent Castellanos, a well-dressed businessman who had used his import-export company to launder drug money for 3 decades. The younger man was David Chun, a former federal prosecutor who had sold out his oath of office to become the Syndicate's legal advisor and chief strategist. Both men carried themselves with the confidence of people who had never faced serious consequences for their actions. "You've caused us quite a bit of trouble, young lady," Castellanos said, his tone conversational despite the threat implicit in his presence. Webb, Mitchell, Morrison, and several others. "Very impressive for someone with no professional training." "My grandmother taught me well," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady while her eyes scanned the surrounding area for potential escape routes or weapons. Shin laughed coldly. "Elena was always too clever for her own good. She thought she could outsmart us indefinitely, but we got to her eventually. Cancer is such a convenient cover for accelerated dying, don't you think?" The casual admission of Elena's murder confirmed what Sarah had suspected but never been able to prove. These men had killed her grandmother slowly and methodically, probably by tampering with her medication or introducing carcinogens into her environment. Elena had suffered for months, knowing that her death was being orchestrated by the very people she had spent decades hiding from. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "The original files, of course," Castellanos said. "All of them, including any copies you've made. In return, we'll make your death quick and painless. It's more consideration than you deserve after the trouble you've caused us." Sarah almost smiled at the arrogance of their assumption that she would simply surrender because they had cornered her in a public place. They had underestimated her once again, just as they had underestimated Elena for 25 years. "I'm afraid I can't help you with that," Sarah said. "You see, the files aren't in my possession anymore." Chen's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you mean?" "I mean that 3 hours ago, copies of every document, Every recording and every photograph were delivered to 47 different law enforcement agencies across the country, Sarah said, watching with satisfaction as the color drained from both men's faces. FBI field offices, U.S. attorneys' offices, state attorney generals, even some international agencies. By now, hundreds of federal agents are reviewing evidence of your crimes. The truth was slightly different from what Sarah had told them. Thomas Valdez had helped her establish a dead man's switch, a system that would automatically release Elena's files if Sarah failed to check in at regular intervals. The files hadn't been released yet, but they would be within hours if she didn't survive this confrontation. "You're bluffing," Castellanos said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah pulled out her cell phone and showed them a screen displaying dozens of delivery confirmations. "Feel free to call some of your contacts in law enforcement and ask them what kind of interesting reading material they received today." Chun grabbed for the phone, but Sarah was already moving, using the crowd of conference attendees to create chaos and confusion. She ducked under Chin's outstretched arm and drove her elbow into his solar plexus, then spun away from Castellanos as he tried to grab her. The marble floor of the conference center was slippery, and Sarah used this to her advantage, sliding between Castellanos' legs and coming up behind him with a joint lock that Elena had taught her years earlier. But Chun was recovering faster than she had expected, and he was reaching inside his jacket for what was obviously a concealed weapon. Sarah released Castellanos and threw herself sideways just as Chin's gun appeared. The first shot went wild, striking the marble pillar behind where she had been standing and sending chips of stone flying in all directions. Conference attendees began screaming and running in all directions, creating the kind of chaos that Sarah needed to survive. Elena had taught her that firearms were most dangerous in the hands of people who were calm and focused. Panic shooters in crowded spaces were far more likely to hit innocent bystanders than their intended targets. Sarah used the fleeing crowd as cover, moving in unpredictable patterns while Chun tried to get a clear shot. Castellanos was back on his feet now, and Sarah could see that he was speaking urgently into his cell phone, probably calling for backup. She had perhaps minutes before more syndicate members arrived, and the conference center would soon be surrounded by police officers who might or might not be trustworthy. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, guiding her through the mental calculations that would determine whether she lived or died in the next few minutes. The conference center had multiple exits, but most of them would be watched or blocked by now. Her best chance was to reach the parking garage, where her escape vehicle was waiting, but that meant fighting her way through at least two armed opponents who knew the building better than she did. Chun fired again, and this time the bullet came close enough that Sarah could hear it pass her ear. She dove behind a registration table, using the heavy wooden structure as cover while she planned her next move. "There's nowhere to run, little girl," Castellanos called out, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "This building is surrounded, and we have people watching every exit. Surrender now, and we'll make this easy for you." Sarah knew he was probably lying about having the building surrounded, but she couldn't take the chance. She needed to create a distraction that would allow her to reach the parking garage without exposing herself to Chin's increasingly accurate gunfire. The registration table was covered with conference materials, including several laptop computers that had been set up for attendee registration. Sarah grabbed one of the laptops and threw it as hard as she could toward the main electrical panel on the far side of the lobby. The impact was enough to trigger the building's emergency lighting system, plunging the area into near darkness broken only by dim red emergency lights. In the confusion that followed, Sarah moved quickly toward the parking garage entrance. Chun fired twice more, but the shots went wide in the darkness. Sarah could hear Castellanos shouting instructions to someone on his phone, coordinating the arrival of additional syndicate members. The parking garage was 3 levels underground, reached by a stairwell that was currently filled with panicking conference attendees trying to evacuate the building. Sarah pushed through the crowd, apologizing as she forced her way down the stairs toward the level where she had left her escape vehicle. But when she reached the second level, Sarah found her path blocked by a familiar figure. Marcus Webb's replacement was a woman named Patricia Santos, a former DEA agent who had been recruited by the syndicate after being caught stealing drug money during her government service. Santos was everything Webb had been and more: faster, smarter, and completely without conscience. "End of the line," Santos said, her service weapon trained on Sarah's center mass. "Vincent wants to talk to you upstairs, but he didn't say you had to be in perfect condition." Sarah raised her hand slowly, appearing to surrender while actually positioning herself for a move that Elena had taught her years earlier. The technique was designed to work against armed opponents who were overconfident in their advantages. "I suppose you think you're clever," Sarah said, taking a small step forward. "Destroying the Phoenix Syndicate from the inside, turning us against each other. But you made one critical mistake." "What's that?" Santos asked, her finger tightening on the trigger. "You assumed we couldn't adapt," Sarah said, and then she moved. Elena had taught her that firearms created a false sense of security in their users. People with guns often forgot to maintain proper distance from their targets, and they frequently became so focused on the weapon that they neglected other threats. Santos made both of these mistakes. Sarah's first move was to step inside Santos's guard, getting close enough that the gun couldn't be brought to bear effectively. Her second move was to grab Santos's wrist and twist it sharply, using a joint lock to force her to drop the weapon. The gun clattered across the concrete floor, out of reach of both women. What followed was the most difficult fight of Sarah's life. Santos was stronger, more experienced, and trained in multiple forms of combat. But Sarah had advantages that her opponent didn't recognize: desperation, grief, and the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had spent decades preparing for this exact situation. The fight raged across the parking garage, both women using cars and concrete pillars as weapons and shields. Santos was trying to subdue Sarah without killing her, following orders to bring her back alive for questioning. Sarah had no such restrictions. She was fighting for her life and the lives of future victims who would suffer if the syndicate survived. The end came when Santos made the mistake of underestimating her opponent's determination. She had Sarah pinned against a concrete pillar and was reaching for zip ties to restrain her when Sarah managed to grab a piece of broken concrete from the floor. The improvised weapon struck Santos in the temple with enough force to render her unconscious instantly. Sarah took Santos's gun and quickly searched her for additional weapons or communication devices. She found a radio that was crackling with reports from other syndicate members positioned around the building. From what she could hear, they had the conference center surrounded, but hadn't yet located her in the parking garage. Sarah's escape vehicle was a modified Honda Civic that Thomas had prepared for situations exactly like this one. The engine had been enhanced for speed and acceleration, the windows were bulletproof, and the fuel tank had been relocated and armored to prevent it from being used as a target. As Sarah reached her car, she cowled.